My brother's kids always got what should have been my daughter's, so I made sure she got. I'm a 36-year-old woman, and I grew up in what you probably call a pretty stable middle-class home. My younger brother Ryan is 2 years younger than me. Our childhood wasn't always smooth sailing, but we never went without essentials, and our parents were always very mindful of their budget. Or so I believed. It wasn't until I was older that I realized their financial resources seemed to consistently benefit one person more than the other. When Ryan graduated high school, my parents fully funded his college education. No student loans or late-night shifts for him. They covered his living expenses, helped significantly with his wedding, and even contributed a substantial down payment for his first house. For me, those opportunities never materialized. I worked 2 jobs throughout my schooling, balancing classes with late-night shifts, meticulously saving every spare penny until I could manage a down payment on my own modest place. My parents offered congratulations when I signed the mortgage papers, but it felt more like polite applause from the audience than genuine celebration. I never voiced my feelings. Not when Ryan's tuition was covered while I was still diligently paying off my student loans. Not when they bought him a new car after his old one gave out, while I was patching up my own used vehicle with duct tape on the bumper. I convinced myself it wasn't worth making a fuss over. It was their money after all and their decision how to spend it. Things didn't magically shift when we started our own families. Ryan and his wife welcomed 2 sons, who are now 8 and 10. My daughter, Sophie, arrived about a year after their youngest. Sophie's father, my husband, passed away when she was quite young, and she's always remained close to his side of the family. She's a gentle, artistic child, happiest with a sketchbook nearby. From the outset, it was clear my parents were thrilled to be grandparents, but their enthusiasm wasn't evenly distributed. Ryan's boys received extravagant birthday celebrations complete with rented bounce houses, elaborate balloon arches, dessert buffets, private school tuition, sports league fees, designer sneakers, and the latest gaming consoles. My parents were more than happy to foot the bill for all of it. Sophie, on the other hand, would get a simple gift on her birthday, maybe a sweater or a pack of pencils. She always thanked them with a smile, but I saw her often glance towards the enormous pile of presents her cousins unwrapped every Christmas. The travel disparity was perhaps the hardest to overlook. My parents treated Ryan's family to trips to Hawaii, Europe, and multiple visits to Disney World. They'd return with photos of ancient castles and sun-drenched beaches, grinning alongside Mickey Mouse. Sophie and I would typically receive a souvenir magnet for our refrigerator. When I inquired about why we weren't included, the usual explanation was a variation of, "Oh, Sophie probably wouldn't enjoy that sort of thing," or "She's too shy for big group excursions." This pattern continued for years. I tried to stay focused, concentrating on raising Sophie well. I didn't want her to develop a sense of entitlement, but I couldn't ignore the widening gulf between how my parents treated her and her cousins. The real turning point happened during a family dinner one evening. We were all gathered around the table, myself, Sophie, my parents, Ryan, and his family, when my dad casually announced they had established college savings accounts for both of Ryan's boys. "We want to make sure they're set for the future," he said, as if sharing ordinary news. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "We didn't set one up for Sophie since Emily is financially independent." A heavy silence fell over the table. Sophie looked down at her plate, her eyes blinking rapidly, trying hard to hold back tears. I reached under the table and squeezed her hand. Ryan eventually broke the quiet with a chuckle, remarking how I was fortunate to have a stable career, and that it must be nice not needing any extra help. I didn't argue. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't make the atmosphere in that room even more suffocating. But that night, as I drove Sophie home, the conversation replayed endlessly in my mind. I knew I couldn't replicate the financial advantages my parents had provided Ryan's family, and maybe I never would. But I was determined to give Sophie something just as meaningful, if not more so. I began contemplating what couldn't be quantified in dollar amounts. Experiences, cherished memories, things that couldn't be taken away or overshadowed. Sophie had always been captivated by art. From a very young age, she'd fill notebooks with drawings of everything she observed. I'd discover her sketches tucked away in her school binders, scattered around her room, even slipped into my work bag as surprise notes. Financially, I wasn't wealthy, but I knew that with careful planning, I could orchestrate something significant for her. Something that would stand on its own regardless of what her grandparents chose to do or not do. It wouldn't be about competing with Ryan or proving a point to anyone. It would be about offering Sophie something valuable to hold on to throughout her life. That evening, after we got home, Sophie immediately retreated to her room with a book. I stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, lost in thought about how to make this happen. I understood I couldn't change my parents' behavior or control their financial decisions. But I could absolutely control what I invested in Sophie's life. By the time I went to bed, my mind was made up. Whatever it took, I was going to give my daughter an experience that couldn't be wrapped in pretty paper, hidden away in a closet, or measured against someone else's pile of gifts. I didn't have the exact details yet, but I knew this. It would be uniquely hers, and no amount of familial favoritism could diminish its importance. Once I decided on the core idea, I started researching every program imaginable that could align with Sophie's artistic passions. My evenings were spent scrolling through websites, reading about youth workshops, art retreats, and international study programs. Most options felt too brief, prohibitively expensive, or simply too generic. I was searching for something that would genuinely challenge her and simultaneously expose her to a part of the world she'd only encountered in books. At home, I began subtly weaving questions into our everyday conversations, like during dinner prep or car rides to school. I'd ask about places she dreamed of visiting, artists she admired most, or museums she'd love to explore. Her face would light up when she spoke of Italy, how she'd learned about the Renaissance in art class, and how the colors in Botticelli's paintings struck her as unlike anything else she'd seen. Florence, she declared, sounded like a city built for artists. One afternoon at work, a colleague overheard me talking about Sophie's artistic interests. She mentioned her own niece had participated in a summer youth art program in Florence the previous year, describing it as a life-changing experience. My colleague pulled up the program's website on her phone, showing me photos of students sketching in front of historic buildings, painting in sunlit studios, and touring renowned galleries with their instructors. The more I read, the more I felt this was exactly right. The initial cost was daunting, making my stomach clench. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't entirely out of reach either, provided I meticulously planned and drastically cut back on expenses for about a year. I sat down with a notepad and itemized everything. Tuition, airfare, a small apartment for us, food, and a buffer for unexpected costs. It would demand sacrifices, but the numbers added up if I remained disciplined. The program's option for parents to attend as chaperones felt like a significant breakthrough. It meant Sophie wouldn't have to travel alone, and I could ensure she made the absolute most of the experience. That very night, I submitted the application. A week later, an email arrived with the acceptance letter. She had secured a spot. I sat staring at the screen for a long time, imagining how thrilled she'd be, but I decided to wait. I wanted the reveal to be a truly special, unforgettable moment. The next hurdle was securing time off work. I approached my boss and explained my need for 3 weeks away during the summer. It meant taking unpaid leave, but nothing was going to deter me. Once the dates were approved, I circled them on my calendar and began counting down the days. Meanwhile, I started subtly preparing Sophie for the surprise. I found a weekend Italian language class for kids at a local community center, telling Sophie it would be fun to learn a new language together. She was enthusiastic, thinking it was just a casual activity. Every Saturday morning we'd attend class, practicing ordering food and asking for directions. Predictably, my parents caught wind of this and didn't hesitate to share their opinions. They laughed about the impracticality of learning Italian when no one nearby spoke it. My mom suggested Sophie should focus on more useful skills instead. Ryan chimed in too, commenting that hobbies are nice, but practical income-generating skills are what truly matter. I didn't engage with their comments, letting them talk while Sophie continued her lessons. She had no idea of the larger plan. To her, these Italian classes were just another one of my spontaneous ideas, much like our month-long bread baking experiment or planting a vegetable garden. I began making significant changes at home to accelerate my savings. I sold our large dining set, which didn't quite fit our space anyway, and replaced it with a smaller second-hand table. I canceled subscriptions we rarely used. I put off replacing our washing machine, which rattled like a runaway train. On weekends, I picked up extra shifts whenever Sophie was busy with friends or staying with her aunt. Speaking of her aunt, my late husband's sister. She became my invaluable quiet supporter. When I confided in her about my plan, she immediately offered assistance. She had travel backpacks we could borrow, a reliable camera, and smart tips for packing light. Every time we met, she'd slip me something useful, a guidebook, a phrasebook, a portable charger. She discreetly kept my secret from everyone else. By the time spring arrived, I realized I was ahead of my savings goal. I had aimed for early summer, but by March I had accumulated enough to cover all the expenses. It felt surreal to have the funds ready after months of scrutinizing every single dollar. I wasted no time. I booked our flights, paid the program fees, and secured a small apartment in Florence, conveniently located near the art school. It wasn't luxurious. Just 2 rooms, a tiny balcony, and a kitchenette. But it was perfect for our needs. I printed out all the confirmation emails and filed them away in a folder I kept hidden in my desk. With everything finalized, I started contemplating the best way to finally share the news with Sophie. I wanted the reveal itself to be as memorable as the trip. I began gathering small items for her. An Italian flag patch, a miniature watercolor set, a map of Florence, little tokens to assemble for the big moment. Meanwhile, the weeks continued to fly by, and I had to maintain a facade of normalcy. Sophie kept attending her Italian classes, learning new phrases and filling her sketchbooks. Ryan's family maintained their usual packed schedule of sports games, outings, and school events, with my parents acting as their enthusiastic cheerleaders. None of them had the slightest inkling of my secret project. By the time the final payment cleared, the reality of it all truly sank in. Everything was in place. All that remained was to find the perfect moment to share the surprise with Sophie. I pictured her reaction, but I tried not to dwell on it too much, wanting the day to unfold organically. I kept imagining us walking down ancient cobblestone streets, enjoying gelato, and standing before the very art she'd only seen in books. And the best part was she had no idea it was coming. That thought alone kept me motivated through long workdays and endless preparation tasks. It was almost time. The plan was tangible. The countdown had truly begun. Sophie's birthday fell on a Saturday that year, and I had been planning the reveal for weeks. I woke up early and set the table with her favorite breakfast. Pancakes shaped like animals, fresh strawberries, and a small stack of wrapped gifts. However, the main present wasn't wrapped at all. I had created a scrapbook filled with photos, postcards, and subtle clues about our upcoming adventure. The first page featured a picture of an artist's palette. The second, a photograph of a cobblestone street. Then came a page with an Italian flag. Each subsequent page revealed a bit more of the puzzle, culminating in the final page, which held the printed confirmation letter from the Florence art program. She turned the pages slowly, reading every word. When she reached the last page, she stopped. Her eyes widened, and she covered her mouth with her hands. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked, "Does this mean we're going to Italy?" I nodded. She erupted into happy tears, hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. That afternoon, we had a small family gathering at my parents' house. Sophie was still radiant, enthusiastically telling me in the car all the things she was excited to see and do. The moment we walked in, she couldn't contain her excitement any longer and shared the news with her grandparents. They offered polite smiles, said it sounded nice, and then immediately shifted the conversation to Ryan's sons and their upcoming soccer tournament. Ryan grinned in that way that never felt genuinely friendly and added a comment about me trying to make Sophie cultured. He delivered it like a joke, but the underlying tone conveyed something else entirely. Sophie thankfully didn't seem to notice. She was too busy showing off the scrapbook to her cousins, who gave it a cursory glance of about 5 seconds before dashing off to play video games. By the next morning, she was already immersed in creating lists of art museums she wanted to visit. She spent hours online researching the Uffizi Gallery, sketching the facade of the Duomo from photographs, and reading about famous painters. Every morning before school, she'd add new destinations, foods, or even intriguing streets to her list. Her sketchbook began filling up faster than I'd ever seen. She drew daily, sometimes in pencil, sometimes with watercolors. Her subjects ranged from our cat to the view from her bedroom window, even attempts at replicating famous paintings she discovered online. A week later, my parents called with a suggestion. They proposed joining us on the trip, thinking it would be enjoyable for everyone, and that they could offer assistance. I politely declined, explaining that this trip was something I specifically wanted to experience with Sophie alone. The ensuing silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes about how that response was received. It wasn't long before comments started filtering in from other relatives. Ryan's wife casually mentioned that my parents felt I was showing off with this trip. I told her plainly that it wasn't about showing off. It was about providing Sophie with an experience crucial for her personal growth. She simply shrugged and changed the subject. While that background noise persisted, I focused on the practical details. I booked guided tours that incorporated sketching time, mapped out walking routes highlighting the city's most picturesque spots, and secured reservations for a couple of local art workshops. I wanted Sophie not just to see the art but also to experience the vibrant everyday life of Florence. The bustling markets, the narrow side streets, the hidden courtyards. A few weeks later, during another family dinner, my parents revisited the topic of the trip. This time, they questioned whether Sophie might get homesick being away for such an extended period. Sophie didn't hesitate before responding that even if she did, the experience would be absolutely worth it. The conversation ended there. As our departure date drew closer, we began shopping for necessary items. We visited an art supply store where Sophie meticulously selected travel-sized watercolor palettes, extra sketchbooks, and high-quality pencils. At a clothing store we found comfortable walking shoes, lightweight jackets, and a couple of versatile dresses suitable for evenings out. She savored every moment of this process, eagerly checking off each item on our packing list. Just a few days before we were scheduled to leave, Ryan decided to offer his unsolicited advice again. He suggested that the money spent on this trip could have been better allocated towards Sophie's future, perhaps for college expenses or a car when she's older. I didn't respond. I simply let him talk while I finished loading groceries into my car. The night before our flight, Sophie and I stayed up late in the living room, suitcases laid open beside us. We curated a playlist for the journey, mixing Italian songs, music from European-themed movies, and some of her favorite upbeat tracks. She danced around the room, tossing clothes into her suitcase, ensuring her sketchbooks and pencils were packed first. Once everything was ready, we set our alarm for the early morning. Sophie double-checked her backpack for her passport and a small stuffed animal she always travels with. She carefully slipped the scrapbook I'd made her into the front pocket so she could revisit it on the plane. We went to bed buzzing with anticipation, knowing that when we woke up, we'd be embarking on the most significant adventure of our lives together. The flight to Florence felt incredibly long, but as the plane began its descent, the rolling Tuscan landscape appeared below. Sophie pressed her face against the window, completely mesmerized. Lush green hills, rooftops tiled in earthy terracotta, and the shimmering ribbon of the Arno River winding its way through the city. It was like watching a masterpiece unfold before my eyes. As the plane touched down, she gripped my arm, still captivated by the view. Navigating the airport customs line's baggage claim felt like a blur. But the moment we stepped outside, the air felt instantly different. Warmer, softer, carrying a blend of roasted coffee, fresh bread, and a delicate floral scent I couldn't quite place. The taxi ride into the city was mostly quiet, punctuated only by the rhythmic click of Sophie's camera, as she tried to capture the narrow streets and buildings adorned with peeling paint and overflowing flower boxes. Our apartment was a modest space with 2 rooms, charmingly creaky wooden floors, and tall windows that opened onto a small balcony. From there we had a clear view of the piazza below, dotted with people seated at cafe tables, sipping espresso and conversing animatedly in Italian. The kitchen was compact but cozy, equipped with a gas stove and a cupboard filled with mismatched plates. Sophie immediately ventured onto the balcony, leaning over the railing to observe a street artist sketching a couple at the corner. That first evening, a knock sounded at our door. An elderly woman stood there, holding a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. She introduced herself slowly, her Italian accented and gentle, explaining she lived next door. She enthusiastically recommended a gelateria just around the corner, and pointed us in the right direction. Sophie grinned, clutching the still warm bread as we thanked her. The following morning marked the orientation session at the art school. Students gathered in a bright classroom with high ceilings and large windows overlooking a central courtyard. Sophie found herself seated next to a girl from Canada, who used the same brand of sketchbook. They quickly struck up a conversation comparing drawings, and by the time the instructor Marco arrived, the two were laughing like old friends. Later that afternoon, we strolled through the city streets until Sophie spotted the gelateria our neighbor had recommended. She approached the counter with confidence and ordered in Italian without a second thought. 2 scoops of pistachio for herself and a cappuccino for me. The man behind the counter beamed at her, and I could see the pride shining in her eyes as she handed over the coins. The program officially kicked off with a visit to the Uffizi Gallery. Marco guided the group through the echoing halls, highlighting significant works by renowned artists and sharing compelling stories behind them. When they reached Botticelli's Primavera, Sophie froze. She found a bench, sketchbook in hand, and began to meticulously trace the elegant curve of a figure's arm, the delicate folds of a dress, the cluster of wildflowers at the painting's base. She remained absorbed for hours, barely moving except to switch pencils. A crowd began to gather around the painting, their voices bouncing off the marble walls. Sophie's shoulders tensed slightly, and she paused her work. I quietly moved closer, pointing out a less crowded vantage point where she could still clearly see the masterpiece. She nodded and resumed her sketching until Marco announced it was time to move on. That night, we began what would become a cherished tradition: balcony dinners. We gathered fresh bread, cheese, and fruit from a local market, and enjoyed our meals while watching the activity in the piazza below. Sophie excitedly recounted everything she had learned that day, her words tumbling out as fast as she could form them. A few evenings later, we walked to a central square just before sunset. A violinist played near the fountain, his open case inviting donations. Sophie positioned herself slightly off to the side, sketching his profile as he played. When he noticed her, he smiled, finished his song, and then with a theatrical bow, presented her with a red rose plucked from behind his music stand. Over the weekend, we explored an open-air art market that had taken over several side streets. Tables overflowed with handcrafted items, paintings, jewelry, and leather goods. At one stall, Sophie ran her fingers over a stack of leather-bound sketchbooks. I bought her one with a rich dark brown cover and thick, creamy pages, perfect for watercolor without bleeding through. The time difference began to catch up with us a few nights in, leaving Sophie unable to sleep. We decided to take a late-night walk along the Arno River. The water lay dark and still beneath the streetlights. Couples strolled hand in hand, and the city seemed quieter, more tranquil than during the day. Sophie paused to sketch the reflection of a bridge in the water before we turned back towards our apartment. Midweek, she sat at the kitchen table, writing her first postcard. She addressed it to her late father's parents, detailing her experiences at the gallery, the delicious gelato, and our friendly neighbor with the homemade bread. She added a small sketch of the piazza in the corner before sealing it. We dropped it into a bright red mailbox on our way to class. By the end of that first week, Sophie stood on the balcony one evening, gazing out over the piazza with her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She turned to me with a soft smile and said she felt like she belonged here. In that moment, it truly seemed like she did. A few days into our second week in Florence, the apartment phone rang. I wasn't expecting a call, so I answered cautiously. My mother's voice came through, relaying that Ryan was upset because Sophie had missed his son's birthday party, as if we had simply forgotten about it. I reminded her that our trip had been planned and booked nearly a year in advance. She grew quiet for a moment before saying she would pass the message along. Sophie, who had been in the next room sketching by the window, had overheard enough to sense the conversation's topic. She walked into the kitchen, pencil still in hand, and asked if her being here had upset anyone. I reassured her that she hadn't, and she returned to her drawing without further comment. At class the next morning, Marco paused by Sophie's easel as she worked on a pastel street scene. He studied it intently, then called the other students over to admire her work. He pointed out the skillful way she had layered the colors to create a realistic sense of light, and Sophie stood there, her cheeks flushed with pride. Not everyone reacted with such praise. Later that day, while students were preparing for the next session, I overheard 2 whispering students. They remarked that she must be wealthy to afford traveling all the way from America for a summer art program. Sophie didn't react, continuing to sort her pencils before returning to her work as if she hadn't heard them. That afternoon, we stopped by the post office to check for any mail. Among the letters was one from my late husband's sister. She had sent a photograph of her garden in full bloom, accompanied by a note encouraging Sophie to capture the world you see. Sophie read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the back pocket of her sketchbook. When we returned to the apartment that evening, I opened my email to find a message from Ryan's wife. She wrote that the funds I had spent on this trip could have been better utilized for Ryan's boys, perhaps for sports equipment, school excursions, or other items they genuinely needed. I read it once, then deleted it without replying. The following morning, I refocused our attention on the purpose of our visit. Sophie had expressed a desire to sketch the Ponte Vecchio, so we headed out early, before the bridge became crowded with tourists. She sat up near the center, resting her sketchbook on the stone parapet. People slowed as they passed, watching her create. A couple paused to take photographs, and one man discreetly dropped a coin onto her page before hurrying away. Later in the week, Marco introduced the group to watercolor techniques. Sophie had never worked with watercolors before, but she quickly embraced the way the paint flowed across the paper. She painted a row of flower pots on a balcony, the colors bleeding together seamlessly, giving the entire scene a lifelike quality. One afternoon, we ducked into a small stationery shop to purchase more paper. The shopkeeper noticed Sophie's sketchbook peeking out of her bag and asked to see it. After a moment's hesitation, she handed it over. He carefully flipped through the pages, nodding approvingly. When he returned it, he also gave her a bundle of postcards featuring iconic Florence landmarks, telling her they were for her to send to friends. The days were packed with activities, and Sophie wanted to experience everything. Eventually, the pace began to wear on her. One evening, she came to dinner looking pale and noticeably tired. I felt her forehead and recognized she had a slight fever. We stayed in the apartment for the next 2 days, keeping the windows open to let in the breeze. She rested, read, and observed the piazza from the balcony. Once she started feeling better, we visited a ceramics workshop. The owner demonstrated how to paint designs on a white plate using specialized glazes. Sophie chose to depict the Florence skyline at sunset, layering soft oranges and deep purples to capture the sky's transition. She worked in quiet concentration, only pausing occasionally to switch brushes. Following this, the calls and emails from home ceased entirely. No birthday reminders, no commentary about the trip, nothing. It was as if the rest of the family had decided to wait until our return to voice any further opinions. With the external distractions gone, our days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Classes in the morning, exploration in the afternoons, and balcony dinners each night. Sophie carried herself differently now, speaking up more confidently in class and taking her time when strangers paused to admire her work. By the end of that week, it was evident she was blossoming in this new environment. Standing with her in the piazza one evening, watching her sketch the fountain as the light turned golden, I knew we were precisely where we needed to be. Midway through our 3rd week in Florence, Marco approached us after class, announcing he had arranged something special. That evening, he led Sophie and me down a narrow street lined with ancient wooden doors, stopping at one that opened into a warm, brightly lit studio. The air carried a subtle aroma of paint and melted wax. Inside, local artists had gathered for a private event, their creations displayed along the walls. In one corner, an artisan was skillfully shaping molten glass into a delicate vase. The glowing orange orb swirled mesmerizingly on the tip of a rod as he worked, and Sophie stood a few feet away, sketching every movement. She captured the way the glass stretched and curved under the artist's breath, the delicate shimmer as it cooled into form. The Canadian girl from Sophie's class was also present, and the 2 young artists found a quiet table to compare their sketches. Before we departed, they exchanged small pieces of their artwork as mementos. A pencil drawing of a street scene from Sophie, and a watercolor of a flower market from her friend. Over the next few days, I began noticing how Sophie's interactions had transformed. At cafes, she confidently ordered for both of us in Italian without hesitation. She initiated conversations with other students while waiting in line, inquiring about their work and readily sharing hers in return. One afternoon, we discovered a flea market set up in a shaded square. Stalls were laden with antique books, hand-painted ceramics, and art supplies. Sophie found a tin of watercolor paints, clearly well used and cherished. She asked the vendor the price, then confidently negotiated in Italian until the cost was reduced. She handed over the euros with a smile, cradling the tin as if it were a precious treasure. Back at the studio, she began working on her first full landscape painting, a scene of rolling Tuscan hills under a vast blue sky. She dedicated several hours over consecutive days to it, adding intricate details each time. When it was completed, Marco announced that it would be featured in the final student showcase at the program's conclusion. During one of the afternoon breaks, another parent from the program approached me. She mentioned she had observed Sophie's artistic progress, and that it was evident she possessed a genuine gift. She added how wonderful it was to see a parent so fully supporting their child's passion. On our final weekend in Florence, Sophie and I climbed a hill overlooking the city just before sunset. The terracotta rooftops glowed under the fading light, and the Duomo's dome stood prominently against the darkening sky. We sat on a bench watching the colors shift and deepen. Sophie turned to me and quietly said, "This means more than anything they could buy." I didn't need to ask who she was referring to. The next day, I received a message from my cousin back home. In passing, she casually mentioned that Ryan's boys had just received a new gaming system from my parents. I didn't bring this up with Sophie. Instead, we opted to spend the day exploring side streets we hadn't yet discovered, finding charming little shops and hidden courtyards overflowing with flowers. That evening, we participated in a pasta-making class at a small family-run restaurant. Sophie expertly rolled out sheets of dough, cut them into neat ribbons, and dusted them with flour. The chef playfully teased her, calling her a natural, and she grinned, holding up a handful of perfectly formed fettuccine. Later that night, after we'd enjoyed the pasta we made and returned to the apartment, Sophie went out onto the balcony with her sketchbook. The piazza was peaceful, save for the low murmur of conversations drifting from the cafe below. She sketched by moonlight, the outlines of the buildings sharp against the dark canvas of the night sky. It was abundantly clear that she would be returning home a transformed individual from the girl who had boarded the plane with me. She moved with a newfound self-assurance, spoke with greater confidence, and seemed genuinely prepared for whatever lay ahead. Watching her work that night, I knew this trip had marked the beginning of something far more significant for her, and it was only the start. On our final day in Florence, the art school hosted its culminating student showcase. The studio had been transformed into a gallery space. The walls were adorned with canvases, sketches, and watercolors created over the past month. Sophie's Tuscan landscape hung prominently near the center, simply framed but illuminated in a way that made the colors truly radiate. Visitors paused before it, leaning in to examine her brushwork. A few individuals approached her with questions about her technique, and she answered them with ease, gesturing to specific elements of the painting. She stood there in her linen dress and sandals, explaining her artistic choices as if she had been doing so for years, a stark contrast to the shy girl who had arrived weeks prior. As the event began to wind down, Marco approached us carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was an old paintbrush, its wooden handle worn smooth from decades of use. He told Sophie it had been his for many years, and now it was hers for the next stage of her artistic journey. She ran her fingers gently over the bristles, holding it with extreme care, as if it were made of spun glass. Before we left the studio, Sophie made her way around the room, exchanging artwork and contact information with her classmates. The Canadian girl presented her with a watercolor depicting the Arno River at dusk, and Sophie gave her a pencil sketch of the Ponte Vecchio. They promised to stay in touch, and their goodbyes lingered until we absolutely had to leave for the airport. The flight home felt long and quiet. Sophie drifted off to sleep shortly after takeoff, her sketchbook resting open on her lap, a pencil still loosely held in her hand. I gently pulled a blanket over her and watched the clouds drift by below until the cabin lights dimmed. Upon landing, my parents were waiting for us in the arrivals area. They offered polite greetings, their expressions unreadable. My mother asked if the trip had gone well, then immediately transitioned to discussing the traffic on the way to the airport. Ryan was also there, leaning against a railing. Before I could even get my bearings, He launched into a detailed account of his son's latest soccer tournament, emphasizing how one of them had scored the winning goal. I listened without responding, focusing instead on guiding Sophie towards the luggage carousel. Outside, while we waited for our car, Sophie retrieved a small package from her carry-on bag. It was the ceramic plate she had painted depicting the Florence skyline. She handed it to her grandparents. My mother took it, commented that it was nice, and placed it in the back seat without further comment. Back home, Sophie unpacked her suitcase, carefully laying out her sketchbooks, paints, and brushes. She cleared a corner of the living room and set up a folding table, arranging her supplies meticulously. She hung one of her smaller watercolors above it, calling it her studio. A few days later, our neighbor stopped by. She had seen Sophie's sketches during her visit and inquired if Sophie would be willing to draw her garden. She offered payment, but Sophie simply smiled and said she would consider it. The following afternoon, Sophie was out there, sketchbook in hand, sitting under the shade of the maple tree, capturing every detail. Word must have spread quickly, because within a few weeks, 2 other neighbors had asked if she could create portraits of their pets. She agreed to one and scheduled the other for a later date. Marco's new paintbrush rested in a jar beside her workspace. Even some extended family members began to take notice. At a weekend barbecue, one of my cousins spotted the framed Florence landscape hanging in our hallway and commented on its quality. She seemed genuinely surprised when Sophie mentioned that she had painted it herself. Others nodded and murmured about her real talent, as if it were something they were only just discovering. In the evenings after dinner, Sophie often worked at her table while I read on the couch. Occasionally, she would pause, tilt her head as if contemplating her work, then return to her painting. One night, she set her brush down and told me she was incredibly glad we took the trip. "The boys can keep getting more things from Grandma and Grandpa," she said. "It doesn't matter. I already have something better." Looking at her then, I knew she was absolutely right. What she had brought home wasn't just a collection of drawings or a head full of memories. She had returned with a palpable sense of independence, the ability to articulate her thoughts and feelings, and the confidence to share her art with the world. That was something no amount of money could ever purchase or take away. And as I watched her lean back over her sketchbook, humming softly as her brush danced across the paper, I understood this was just the beginning.